Rome spoke of laws and tradition, but the decisions that truly mattered were made behind the veil of etiquette, measured cups, precise greetings, seats chosen down to the millimeter. That night, the heir with full rights occupied a place that seemed like an honor but was a trap. There were no swords or speeches, mere courtesies and a script everyone knew without needing to read it were enough. In that context, a tiny detail began to twist everything, a name spoken when it shouldn't have been. How do you erase a legitimate successor without setting the city on fire or challenging the Senate? This is the story of Britannicus, a young man prepared to inherit, and of a power that preferred discretion over justice. His lineage, which had protected him for years, that night became a signal. The order at the table, the treatment he received, the silence of those present, every gesture carried more weight than a decree. No one spoke orders aloud, yet everyone understood. And the turning point had a clear, brief, almost courteous sound, Domitius. To understand that Palatine table, let's go back a few years. Not too far, just enough to see how a single word, spoken softly, had been brewing for a while. In that scene appears Agrippina, patient and meticulous. She marries Claudius, ensures that her son Lucius Domitius is adopted and renamed Nero, and provides him with two key supports, Seneca, to craft his speech, and Burrus, to instill order. No sword clashes occur. There is a plan advancing in small, sure steps. The city learns to read signals. A greeting lasts a little longer, a chair moves closer to the center, a name is spoken before another, a coin bears the correct face. These are gestures that seem like details, but they teach everyone who must be seen as the future. Etiquette ceases to be decoration, it becomes a message. At the same time, something more discreet is being adjusted within the palace. It makes no noise and requires no extravagance. It works through monitored closeness, favors that appear and vanish, confidences that seem like rewards but end up as soft chains. Gradually, prudence becomes habit, obedience, and obedience, the appearance of normality. It is a method that doesn't intimidate at first glance, which is why it is so effective. With that atmosphere already in place, the night that matters arrives. The guests need no instructions, every glance, every toast, every seat at the table says what needs to be said. There are names that open doors and names that remind everyone of each person's origin. It is enough to pronounce them at the right moment for everyone to understand what will not be spoken aloud. There will be no outbursts. There will be decisions. At dawn, it seems that nothing has changed, but everything is different. The factions recalculate, the Senate weighs every word, the Praetorian Guard takes note. Rome does not publish an announcement but sends a clear signal to its elite: from now on, blood alone will not uphold a throne if the story being told goes in a different direction. Later, we will look at what Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio wrote. Not to repeat them, but to ask what they chose to emphasize and what they preferred to omit. And then the question that crosses centuries remains: if the rules do not protect the legitimate heir, whom are they willing to protect? If you enjoy this journey through history and want more episodes like this, subscribe to the channel and leave a like, it helps the series continue. Before that dinner, Rome had already written half of the outcome. The empire did not operate under a simple rule of, the eldest inherits, it worked through something subtler, agreement. The next in line was not just the one with the best blood, but the one who managed to unite three forces at once: the Senate's assent, the Praetorian Guard's tranquility, and the perception, among the people, that this was the correct name. The law provided forms, yes, but the real impulse came from elsewhere. Rome valued both authority and power. Authority was prestige and accumulated trust, power was the ability to make things happen. When both converged in one person, the path opened. How was that built? With a precise mix, convincing kinship or an adoption that mimicked it, a story that sounded credible, and public signals that said, without saying, this is the future. That is why adoptions mattered so much. They were not sentimental gestures, they were political tools. A child could become a son for the purposes of the throne if the narrative supported it. Everything else was state choreography, honors voted in the Senate, oaths measured in the Praetorian camp, and symbols speaking everywhere, coins, portraits, inscriptions, invitations to ceremonies at just the right moment. To the citizen, all of this amounted to a wink, understand where the current flows. Since Augustus, the dynasty had perfected this language. Tiberius was not the firstborn, he was adopted. Caligula gained popularity through his name and how it was displayed. Claudius came as an emergency solution, and Rome accepted him because the machinery presented him as such. The lesson was clear, biography mattered, but the staging sealed the deal. Now look at Britannicus and Nero within that system. Britannicus had a huge advantage, being born of the emperor gave him a legitimacy that no one could ignore. But Nero had been placed patiently where it mattered most, educated by Seneca to sound convincing, backed by Burrus to appear confident, exposed to the right eyes so that his figure would seem familiar. While Britannicus embodied right, Nero accumulated acceptance. So, when both share the same palace, it's not just two young men facing each other, it's two narratives clashing. One rests on lineage, the other on the coalition Rome needs to sleep peacefully. And in that clash, words become fine knives. Calling Nero by his old name in public is not a mere habit, it grazes the heart of the narrative that sustains him. After that word, every gesture carries double weight. With this framework, what happened on the Palatine night ceases to be a mystery. It's not a sudden surprise, it's the consequence of a political language that Rome had been practicing for years. When the city accepts that the future already has a face, any dissonance sounds like a challenge. And a challenge, at that table, doesn't need speeches to get a response. Ready to meet the flesh and blood Britannicus, the boy behind the title? If you approve this section, I'll continue with section 4, Britannicus, born legitimate. He was born when Rome was still stunned by Claudius's rise. It was the year 41 AD, and at court, there was a sense that everything could change overnight. That child was named Tiberius Claudius Caesar Britannicus, not just any name. Britannicus celebrated the victories his father sought to consolidate on the northern island. From the cradle, the son carried a message: continuity, conquest, future. He grew up amid rituals that turned the everyday into politics. The color of the toga, the order of greetings, the spot where a tutor left a scroll, everything spoke of tomorrow. Britannicus had what no one could manufacture at will: birth. He didn't need to convince anyone with speeches, his mere presence reminded all that, when Claudius was gone, there was a natural heir. But in Rome, nothing stays still. Britannicus's mother, Messalina, fell from grace a few years later. Her execution opened a dangerous vacuum. Not only did he lose a protector, but the map of loyalties around his cradle was also rearranged. In the palace, doors that once opened by inertia began to creak. The boy was still the legitimate heir, yes, but the environment was no longer the same. Then Agrippina the Younger appeared. She didn't come tearing down walls, she changed the landscape piece by piece. She married Claudius, brought her son Lucius Domitius into the center of the scene, and achieved something crucial: imperial adoption. From that moment, Rome stopped seeing a boy of good lineage and began looking at Nero, the young man who, with tutors and backing, could present himself as a stable solution. Britannicus, by contrast, was still a minor, and his time, that resource power uses to its advantage, began to work against him. Even so, the boy was not a shadow. Sources remember him as diligent, reserved, with the education befitting a prince: music, oratory, history, physical discipline, and above all, silent training to be observed without error. He quickly learned that, in Rome, a gesture could build or ruin a reputation. He also understood that legitimacy doesn't spare you enemies, sometimes it multiplies them without a word being spoken. There were days when the palace seemed to accept his destiny, tutors treating him as what he was, centurions bowing a second longer than usual, senators smiling with the caution of those taking mental notes. And there were other days when the tide slipped away silently: a postponed audience, a seat shifted a few inches, an invitation arriving late. Nothing scandalous, everything significant. The boy looked around and saw how Nero accumulated visibility. It wasn't a parade of triumphs, it was a chain of correct presentations, public readings in the precise tone, appearances alongside influential names, well-placed words of respect. Meanwhile, Britannicus was wrapped in colder courtesy, the kind that maintains form but reduces the margin of movement. In Rome, that was understood without needing to be announced. His character, at least as we reconstruct it, was that of someone trying to fulfill what was expected of him without provoking confrontation. He was neither a provocateur nor an early conspirator. Precisely for that reason, he represented a problem for those who preferred an air already shaped. By not openly challenging, Britannicus remained a possible option for many, and the possible, in politics, is a shadow that cannot be ignored. Underlying it all was a tension anyone could perceive, the difference between having the right and having the moment. The right was with Britannicus, the moment was being crafted for Nero. When both share banquets and ceremonies, every greeting becomes a wager and every word a signal. In that climate, legitimacy ceases to be a guarantee and becomes a question hovering over the table: how much is blood worth when the narrative moves in the opposite direction? Thus, we arrive at the threshold of the scene that will set the course. A young man with the name of Victory, raised to inherit, sits where his rank dictates. A few steps away, another young man, carefully adopted and presented, occupies a place that leaves no doubt about what many had already accepted. There is no need for proclamations. Tension is measured not in decibels, but in centimeters and timing. And in that arena, Britannicus still holds something decisive, the weight of his existence, the mere possibility that forces others to take sides, even if they would prefer to remain silent. Agrippina did not enter with fanfare, she came as one who arranges a room before an important visit. In 49 AD, she married Claudius and, from that day, began to redraw the future with movements that seemed routine yet were decisive. Her goal was clear, that her son, until then Lucius Domitius, would become the accepted face of tomorrow. First came the adoption. It was not a domestic detail, but a first-order political act. When Claudius adopted him, the boy ceased to be Domitius and presented himself as Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. The new name did two things at once: it tied him to the glory of his ancestors and positioned him, in the eyes of Rome, on the same rung as anyone born in the imperial house. From that moment, the conversation was no longer Agrippina's son, but the emperor's son. Next was the entourage. Agrippina brought back Seneca to refine the young man's voice, tone, arguments, moderation in public. By his side, she placed Burrus at the head of the Praetorian Guard, discipline, security, and a bridge to the soldiers who protected the capital. One shaped authority, the other safeguarded power. Together, they made Nero a choice that sounded reasonable even to those who did not yet need him, until they began to. The next step was sealing the family alliance. In 53 AD, Nero married Octavia, Claudius' daughter. With this bond, the story was complete. In the halls, a simple and effective idea was repeated: the son-in-law educated by Seneca and backed by Burrus offered continuity without trauma. In a city that feared upheaval, that promise was priceless. Public signals accompanied the narrative. Coins with shared profiles, official honors, appearances at ceremonies where the seating order said more than any speech. Rome learned to see Nero as part of the center, not as an invited figure. Etiquette ceased to be a mere courtly ornament and became a brief manual of succession. Agrippina also secured her own position. She obtained honors uncommon for a woman of the dynasty, appeared alongside Claudius at official representations, and managed audiences that others considered beyond her reach. It was not vanity, it was a way to strengthen the narrative. If she was in the spotlight, her son was one step closer. If she opened doors, he passed through first. Meanwhile, Britannicus remained there, legitimate by birth. No one erased him in an instant. Simply, the scene was illuminated differently. When the emperor made his final decision, the city would already have seen Nero as the solution and Britannicus as an increasingly distant possibility. What carries more weight in Rome, an inherited right, or a consensus that already behaves as if the decision has been made? The culmination of the maneuver was not applause, but a shared feeling, with Nero adopted, educated, married within the family, and visible where it mattered. The idea of his succession ceased to be boldness and became routine. And routine, in politics, turns into habit, habit becomes norm, norm becomes destiny. When Claudius died in 54 AD, everything that had been insinuated over the years came into view. No one needed to explain much. The young man who already spoke as he should, sat where he belonged, and appeared on the right coins, took the central place. Britannicus, younger, remained an uncomfortable question that power was unwilling to leave open for long. From here, the climate shifted. There were no violent proclamations or visible clashes, there was caution and calculation. The court understood that any gesture toward Britannicus could be read as a challenge to the newly secured stability. This silent tension leads directly to what you will see in the next section, the quiet war of protocol, where a word, a seat, or a glance can decide more than 1,000 orders. In Rome, the most dangerous battles rarely made noise. They were fought through customs. The morning began with the salutatio, rows of people waiting to greet the powerful. Not everyone entered the same way or at the same time. Being received first meant, you matter. Waiting while others passed ahead said, your place is shifting. Britannicus noticed, one day, immediate access, another, wait a moment, repeated enough times to become a message. At banquets, the choreography of the triclinium spoke for everyone. 3 couches, several places, a hierarchy that anyone could understand. Approaching the central position was a favor, sliding a few centimeters toward the edge was a warning. There was no need to move someone from the room, rotating a cushion or changing a table companion was enough to reorder the importance of each guest. The day they placed Nero half a step closer to the center, many understood that the future had already been rehearsed. The way people were addressed also carried weight. In a court where a name could be a brief biography, saying Caesar or Domitius was not the same. Caesar indicated the present adoptive status and the emperor's backing, Domitius recalled the earlier origin. Using one or the other in public was not a slip, it was a choice of which story you wanted to survive. A misapplied form of address could chill a room. Official processions and appearances were another board. Who walks beside whom? Who holds the document? Who receives the gaze of the master of ceremonies before beginning? That Nero appeared twice in a row next to the right person, a rising general, a key magistrate, was no coincidence, it was a silent explanation for anyone willing to listen, this is how things will be seen. Even documents spoke. In records and announcements, the order of names defined priorities. That the scribe pronounced Nero first and Britannicus afterward could be justified in 1,000 ways, but the pattern remained. Repeated, it built custom, custom built expectation. Rumor was the minor currency of the court. There was no need to invent big stories, careful comments were enough. Today I saw him enter first, he was seated next to the prefect, the new coin shows his profile. They were not proof, but signals. The city learned to read them and acted accordingly, build a bridge, keep distance, do not commit. In the midst of that language, a small affront could become an earthquake. A greeting that lasted too long to Britannicus in front of Nero's men, a carefully timed laugh when someone called him by his old name, a cup that took too long to reach the correct position. Nothing scandalous, everything eloquent. At the end of the night, no one could quote a compromising phrase, yet everyone knew which side carried more weight. For Britannicus, the challenge was to remain impeccable without seeming provocative. Always respond with the proper formula, do not contest inches, do not cast a shadow in spaces where others had already decided who should shine. In that restraint lay his last strength, to remind the room that right still existed, even if the scene favored the other. This is how silent warfare works, a sum of gestures that break nothing immediately but change the atmosphere until breathing becomes effort. The change did not arrive by decree, it arrived with fewer open doors. Britannicus began to have classes, audiences, and routines moved until he was left in a small, predictable circuit. Then came intermittent favor, one day he was shown in a reading, then weeks without appearing. He learned that his place depended on the next external gesture. Surveillance did the rest. Attentive servants, timely messengers, scribes noting who approached. Dealing with him left a trace, and many chose not to. His circle was muted with delays, procedures cooled, and honors withheld, deterrence, not threat. In parallel, insinuations circulated, that he needed rest, that his tutors were reviewing progress. Nothing concrete, enough to sow fragility. Result, Britannicus remained legitimate, but increasingly impractical. In the eyes of the elite, supporting Nero seemed continuity, supporting Britannicus, a problem. The triclinium was arranged with precision. Lamps lit, music low, 20 high-ranking guests. Nero presides. To his right, Britannicus. Nothing out of place, and yet everyone perceives that this night allows no mistakes. The servants move as if following a metronome. Plates, toasts, compliments. The conversation avoids heavy topics. Every gesture confirms rehearsed hierarchies. Then comes the detail that is not announced, a cup prepared by expert hands. It is not explained, it simply appears when it must. Britannicus drinks. A moment later, the atmosphere shifts without a single raised tone. The young man brings his hand to his chest, loses the thread of the conversation. Gazes freeze, but no one rises. Nero tilts his head with a measured look of concern. Someone suggests it isn't old ailment. The music drops a notch. The curtains close a little more. No audible orders. There are signals. A prefect nods wordlessly. Guests remain where they are, as if moving were a political statement. The evening ends with short phrases and composed faces. The version that will circulate before dawn is clean, a sudden episode, something feared since childhood. Rome knows how to accept that kind of explanation. The next day, there are no proclamations, only normality. Minimal honors, proper mourning, commitments unchanged. The essential message, the possibility that troubled the palace no longer exists. Power made no noise, it did not need to. The city understands, once again, that ceremony can determine what decrees describe only afterward. Rome woke up without surprises. The markets opened, the baths steamed, and the town criers repeated the official version, a sudden episode. No one disputed it publicly, it wasn't necessary. In the capital, silence is also a vote. In the Senate, speeches were cautious and brief. Measured condolences, formal praise for the continuity of government. The important thing wasn't in the words, but in the gestures, nodding heads, tunics avoiding certain glances, senators postponing initiatives that could be interpreted as challenges. The Praetorian Guard maintained order with ostentatious normalcy. Guards at their posts, punctual rotations, no signs of alarm. The message was clear, stability. Anyone thinking of alternatives understood that there were no gaps to exploit. In the palaces, factions did the math. Some distanced themselves from former allies, others took a step closer to the new central shadow. A lesson circulated without a signature, supporting Nero was betting on what already worked, insisting on Britannicus had ceased to be prudence and had become stubbornness. For the city, everything continued as if nothing had happened. For the elite, the essential changed, the last dynastic doubt disappeared. From that day on, any gesture of nostalgia for the legitimate option was read as political clumsiness. There were no grandiloquent decrees, but a precedent was set. In Rome, the narrative that imposes itself decides which lives continue to matter. What we know of this story comes from three main voices. Tacitus writes with a senator's hand and a moral purpose, to show how power without limits corrupts. This gives him the clarity to detect abuses, but it also pushes him to emphasize what fits his thesis. Suetonius is a palace biographer, he collects memorable anecdotes, court gossip, and scenes that resemble theater. Fascinating, but one must filter carefully. Cassius Dio, later, compiles earlier materials with a statesman's judgment. He provides a framework, although sometimes his temporal distance softens or exaggerates. So where should we rely? Think on 3 levels. Certain, Britannicus, Nero, Agrippina existed, there was adoption, succession was played out at the crossroads of the Senate, the Praetorians, and public opinion. The dinner on the Palatine and Britannicus's sudden death appear in more than one source. Probable, the use of poisons in court intrigues, the figure of Locusta, the disciplinary role of Seneca and Burrus, the war of protocol as a language of power. It fits Roman practices and patterns seen in other episodes. Debatable, perfect dialogues, overly polished scenes, intimate motivations described as if they had been recorded. Here, it's better to read them as symbols rather than as notarized facts. Moreover, Rome had a special talent for making every event exemplary. If history taught a moral lesson, it told it like a parable. That's why details such as a name spoken publicly or a cup at the exact moment function both as plausible facts and as narrative devices. We don't need to deny them, we need to frame them. What happened on the Palatine needs no embellishment. It was a demonstration that the most effective power operates quietly and leaves few traces. Britannicus remains an uncomfortable reminder: if the brakes fail, history is decided outside of speeches. Rome stayed standing, yes, but at the price of looking the other way. That is the lesson that reaches us today: rules matter only as much as those who dare to uphold them. If this episode taught you something, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. That way you support the series and help us bring more stories that show how truly great decisions are made.